Ever since the tank's debut in the First World War, it has remained a fearsome weapon that strikes terror in the hearts of enemies. With heavy weapons and thick armor, even just one of these metal beasts can be a formidable foe, let alone dozens or even hundreds. In the 1980s, deep in the scorching expanse of the Sahara Desert, Chad faced this daunting challenge when it was confronted by hundreds of Libyan T-55s in the final phase of the Chadian-Libyan War. But with one crucial disadvantage. They had no tanks of their own. Thinking outside the box, with ingenuity as their weapon, Chad turned to the humble pickup truck. Defying all odds, these unassuming vehicles would ultimately turn the tide of the war, and Chad would emerge victorious in one of history's most remarkable displays of military creativity. Our story begins during the decolonization of Africa, a time when most of the continent was rife with civil wars and instability. Chad was no exception to this, and for much of the 1960s and 70s, Chad was at war with the Muslim National Liberation Front of Chad, or FROLANAT, who waged an insurgency in the northern part of the country. Further north, Libya was also embroiled in political instability in a coup d'etat which would see Gaddafi rise to power. Previously, Libya had only played a minor part in Chad's civil war, granting asylum to the insurgents, but not doing much else to avoid angering Western powers. But with Gaddafi's arrival, all of that changed virtually overnight. Gaddafi began to see a great use for FROLANAT as a way for him to expand his power. Soon he began not only harboring the insurgents, but also arming and training them with the help of the Eastern Bloc. Then, as the rebels began kicking things up a notch with their new firepower, Gaddafi laid an official claim to the Ojo Strip, a piece of land on Chad's northern border. That's mostly just barren desert, so it might not seem like it's worth all the trouble, but there are supposedly massive quantities of uranium there. And this wasn't the first time Libya had tried to take the region. They'd attempted to invade it a couple of decades earlier, but at the time, Chad was a French colony and the Libyan assault had been repelled by French colonial troops. But France seemed to be largely out of the picture now that Chad was independent, and there was no better time for Libya to snatch it up. Meanwhile, in Chad, after a failed coup d'etat, which was, of course, blamed on Libya, the Chadian president, Francois Tombalbaye, cut all diplomatic ties with its northern neighbor. Then, on the same day as the failed coup, he laid a historical claim to Fezzan, a region in southwestern Libya. Gaddafi's response was to officially recognize the Chadian insurgency as the sole legitimate government in Chad, and he began ramping up efforts to take the Ojo Strip. As the fighting went on, both on the grounds and in the political sphere, France and Niger stepped in to play mediating roles, and eventually a deal was reached in 1972. Libya would pay Chad £40 million, and Chad would cede the Ojo Strip fair and square. Everyone signed the papers, the fighting stopped, and diplomatic relations resumed. Gaddafi even stopped assisting the insurgency and forced them to relocate their headquarters to Algeria. But if you know anything about post-colonial African conflicts, you'll know that the story is, well, never quite so simple. Just 3 years later, another coup was attempted on Chad's president, but this time around, they were successful. Tombalbaye was removed from power by a group who believed that he had done too much to appease Libya instead of standing up for his nation, and he was replaced with a man named Felix Mahoum. Gaddafi took offense to this and began resupplying the FROLANAT insurgents, and just like that, the conflict was back in full swing. And by 1976, following a failed assassination attempt on the Chadian president, Libyan soldiers began making regular trips into Chad alongside their insurgent allies. But some of the insurgents didn't trust Gaddafi. After all, the last time they'd worked with him, he'd dumped them and made them move to Algeria. Soon the FROLANAT was fracturing opinions about Libyan support, and by 1977, the FROLANAT had completely split into two factions. The larger faction, still loyal to Gaddafi, was the People's Armed Forces, or FAP, and now that the Libyan leader knew he could place his full trust in them, his support skyrocketed. Before, the only support the insurgents received was some training, a safe place to stay, and the occasional crate of ammunition, along with the moral support of being part of Gaddafi's expanding sphere of influence. But with the new loyal FAP, Gaddafi began sending heavy weapons that he'd purchased from Eastern Bloc countries, like rocket-propelled grenades, 82mm mortars, and thousands of AK-47s. With this new weaponry, the FAP pushed deeper into Chad and struck Chadian bases in the northern Tibesti region, capturing most of the area and killing hundreds of Chadian soldiers. Large-scale conflict erupted as the rebels were supported by Libyan artillery and air support, capturing cities with ease as they moved toward the capital. The Chadian military secured supplies from the United States and Zaire and rapidly pushed the insurgents back. They had so much momentum that they threatened to even retake the Ajou Strip. Gaddafi realized that he was about to lose everything he had fought for, so he authorized Libyan armored divisions to head south and turn the tide of the war. Unfortunately for him, this caught the attention of France. France was in an interesting position here because they had military advisors and weapons sent to Chad to help defend their former colony, but also were doing their best to not step on Gaddafi's toes as they had some nice trade going on with him. So, well, bit of a conflict of interest there. However, they were committed to maintaining Chad's sovereignty, and so with this new escalation in 1978, the French Foreign Legion showed up, relieving a besieged Chadian army who had only just held off their attacking forces. The battle proved to be quite an easy one for the French, who had undisputed air superiority from the moment they arrived because Libyan pilots refused to even contest them. France eventually withdrew from Chad, but they returned just a few years later when a renewed Libyan offensive began heading southward. But this time around, the French were getting sick of it and drew a line in the sand. At the 16th parallel, a border was marked, dividing Chad roughly in half. The north controlled by Gaddafi's rebels under de facto Libyan control, and the south controlled by Chad. The international community seemed largely content with this outcome as long as the fighting came to an end, but the final phase of the conflict was approaching, and the Chadians did not plan on letting Libya keep half of their country. After the border was set up, there was a big lull in the fighting, and eventually France and Libya both agreed to withdraw troops from their respective halves of the war-torn country. French President François Mitterrand honored his end of the deal, and by mid-1984, all French troops had left Chad. But Gaddafi was in no rush to lose his grip on his hard-earned territory and made sure to keep a few thousand of his men in the area, along with many tanks. Mitterrand was understandably upset about this and met with Gaddafi shortly after to discuss the withdrawal. The essence of the meeting was basically Gaddafi saying,
Yeah, I'm definitely going to withdraw my forces. Don't you worry about that, Frenchie.
Now, of course, he didn't, but for a while, he also didn't dare make a move south out of fear that France would retaliate. Gaddafi eventually took his chance in 1986 and attacked Chad right before the French legislative elections. He hoped that the upcoming elections would make the French president reluctant to cause controversy abroad, but this gamble did not pay off. Instead, France took a strong stance against Libya's aggression and returned more than 1,000 troops to Chad to train and assist the local army, resulting in the Libyan offensive being crushed and forcing them to retreat to the 16th parallel. But his failed offensive had done more than just waste some manpower and anger the French again. It had caused the Chadian rebels in the north to begin losing their support for Gaddafi, who they felt was no longer serving their needs. As the rebel front began to fracture into several groups once again, the insurgency dissipated, leaving only the Libyan military in northern Chad and a small force of loyal locals. But even without the rebels, the Libyan presence was still daunting, numbering nearly 10,000 troops and at least 300 tanks. However, because the insurgents had largely acted as infantry and reconnaissance for the Libyans, their absence meant that Libyan garrisons were little more than armored oases spread across the Sahara, heavily armed but isolated, each consisting of dozens of old Soviet tanks. But without tanks of their own, Chad had to find a way to face this armor in open combat. Their solution? The Toyota Hilux, a pickup truck that had been released to the global market just a decade earlier. There's nothing groundbreaking or flashy about the truck. It was just a durable, reliable vehicle with a perfect spot in the back for a French Milan anti-tank missile. This type of vehicle is known as a non-standard tactical vehicle, but usually it's referred to as a technical. The Toyota War would be far from the first time that technicals have been used, as their use dates all the way back to the Russian Civil War and the Polish-Soviet War, where takankas were employed, which was essentially a machine gun mounted on a horse carriage. Technicals also saw extensive use in the Second World War as long-range hit-and-run squads, but Chad was about to bring things to a whole new level with modern guided weaponry. In total, France provided 400 Toyotas, creating a swarm of lethal and lightweight anti-tank units driven by highly motivated Chadian soldiers who were ready to risk it all. After the French set up an ammunition and fuel hub, the reconquest of the north was ready to begin, and the first target was selected, the city of Fada, a Libyan stronghold guarded by more than 1,500 men, 105 T-55 tanks, and 51 BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles. A force to be reckoned with, for sure, but this fearsome base would prove no match for the might of Toyota. On January 2nd, 1987, Chad surrounded the garrison with its tsunami of pickup trucks and began an all-out attack from every direction. The fight was brutal, but it was short, and in the sea of explosions that erupted in Fada, an astonishing 92 Libyan tanks and 33 infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed, while Chad only lost 3 trucks. You can imagine Gaddafi's jaw dropping to the floor when he heard the news of what had happened, and in retaliation he ordered bombings of Chad and called all army reservists to active duty. Soon, more than 10,000 reinforcements rushed into the annexed territory, desperate to slow down the relentless charge of Chad's technicals. But armed with determination and US satellite intelligence, the Chadian army pushed forward, and the next target was Libya's primary airbase in the occupied region, Ouadi Dome. Ouadi Dome was heavily guarded by tanks, bunkers, minefields, and more than 5,000 men, but it was all futile. The mines didn't stop the Toyotas, as Chadian drivers quickly learned that if they drove fast enough at least 60 miles per hour or almost 100 kilometers per hour, the landmines would either fail to detonate or the truck would already be a safe distance away before detonation. This meant that the Toyotas essentially cruised right over the minefields, allowing them to encircle and constrict the airbase just like they'd crushed Fada before. The Ouadi Dome airbase was quickly annihilated, and the aircraft that couldn't take to the sky were destroyed where they sat. Libyans suffered heavy casualties not only from Chadian forces, but also from their own minefields as they fled the battle. One by one, the army of pickup trucks surrounded and destroyed Libyan strongholds with such speed and ferocity that Libya began bombing its own supply depots as they failed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. By August 1987, nearly all of Chad had been liberated, with only the disputed Ojo Strip remaining, the piece of desert that had started this whole mess. The Chadian army at this point was so confident that the next attack was across the border on Libyan soil at the Matan al-Sara airbase. The Libyans were completely caught by surprise, and in the chaos, 32 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, including MiG-21s and 23s, as well as several helicopters. It wasn't until September that Gaddafi finally scored a victory in this phase of the war, and he only did so by abandoning his previous tactics and instead copying the Chadians and adopting a mobile army comprised of jeeps and, you guessed it, Toyota pickup trucks. Using this strategy, the Libyans were able to defeat the Chadians in one battle in the Ojo Strip. The victory was so important for morale that Gaddafi immediately flew journalists to the scene and made sure that it was front page on every newspaper across Libya. However, this would ultimately be the final event in what journalists were already calling the Toyota War. The Libyan conversion to Chadian tactics brought the war largely to a stalemate as both sides struggled to make any advances, especially as the US and France were hesitant to assist Chad now that they were striking Libyan soil. Under intense international pressure, especially from their African neighbors who feared an all-out war, both sides signed a ceasefire in September 1987. This was far from the first ceasefire in the war though, and because all the other ones had been largely ignored, there was a big fear that this would also turn out to be nothing more than a bandage on a broken bone. But this one actually stuck, and the only violations of it were fairly minor. Eventually, diplomatic relations were revived, and Gaddafi announced that he would recognize Chad's president as legitimate in what he called a gift to Africa. And then, after failing to come to an agreement on his own, both sides agreed to take the issue of the Ojo Strip to the International Court of Justice. In 1994, the decision was voted 16-1 in favor of Chad, and the Ojo Strip has been secured ever since. While the Toyota War officially ended in the 1980s, its legacy has lived on. The Toyota Hilux has proved to be such an affordable, reliable vehicle that militant groups across the world began to adopt it as a technical. According to Andrew Exum, a US military analyst, the Toyota Hilux, along with the larger Toyota Land Cruiser, is essentially the vehicular equivalent to the AK-47. Cheap and effective. But it really comes as no surprise when you understand how durable they are. On a 2006 episode of Top Gear, a Toyota Hilux with 190,000 miles on its odometer was driven into a tree, dropped in the ocean, had a trailer dropped on it, was hit by a wrecking ball, and then set on fire. And by the end, a mechanic was able to get the engine running with nothing more than some wrenches and a bit of WD-40, no spare parts required. One soldier remarked, "You can't underestimate the value of having a vehicle that is fast, will never break down, and is strong enough to mount a heavy weapon in the back." And it's for these reasons that they caught on so quickly. Following the Toyota War, they were used extensively in Somalia after the collapse of its government as factions battled for control. Afghanistan was full of them, both in use by the Taliban and US Special Forces. Nicaragua, Pakistan, Ethiopia, the list goes on. Essentially, if there's an insurgency and the insurgents can't afford a tank, you can expect a Hilux to show up. But despite the vehicle's reputation shifting into a staple of rebellions everywhere, its most famous moment will always be the time it cruised across the Chadian desert, too quick for landmines and too deadly for Libyan tanks.